everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Giller Book Club. My name is Daphne Rabinovich, and I'll be your host tonight. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. And it is my profound pleasure tonight to introduce you to our interviewer, Tanis Rideout. Tanis Rideout's internationally acclaimed first novel, Above All Things, was a national bestseller, named to numerous Best Book of the Year lists, and published in several languages around the world. It was awarded the Premio Itas del Libro de Montaña and was longlisted for the International Impact Dublin Literary Award. Her new novel is The Sea Between Two Shores. She is also the author of the poetry collection Arguments with the Lake, and in 2006, she was named the Poet Laureate for Lake Ontario by the environmental advocacy group Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. And tonight, Tanis will be interviewing Kathryn Kuitenbrouwer, whose novel, Wait Softly Brother, was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize last year. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. They will be looked at during the last 15 minutes of the interview. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tanis and Kathryn.
Thanks, Daphne. Hi, Kathryn. It's always so nice to hear your bio read out. You get reminded of all of the things that you've done. So let me introduce you properly. Kathryn Kuitenbrouwer is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist who makes Prince Edward County, Ontario, her home. Her most recent novel is Wait Softly Brother. She is also the best-selling author of the novels All the Broken Things, Perfecting, and The Nettle Spinner, as well as the short fiction collection Way Up. Her writing has been nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Toronto Book Award, Canada Reads, the Relit Prize, the Amazon First Novel Award, and the Trillium Award, and has won a Dwanta Gleed Award and a Sydney Prize. Kathryn has taught and mentored creative writing students at Colorado College, the University of Toronto, University of Guelph, Brock University, and the Royal Military College. She currently mentors private clients as well as graduate fiction students in the MFA at the University King's College in Halifax. Hi, Kathryn. So nice to see you.
Hi, Tanis. Lovely to see you too.
So congrats, first off, on your wonderful novel. I didn't know what I was getting into when it arrived, and it's extraordinary. There's so much to talk about. We're going to get into that. It's also just like a great page turner, and I was just like from the first sentence was in, and I'm really excited to talk about a lot of things in this book. But maybe before we get started, for those in our audience who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, you could give us a little description of it and maybe a brief reading.
Sure. Thanks, Tanis. So this is the novel, Wait Softly Brother, and I conceived it as a autofiction, but also as a kind of a hoax. Like, it acts as if it's an autofictional text, which is to say it acts as if it's autobiographical and also fictional, which normally means that the novel follows to some extent or to some large extent the truth of the life of the author. But in this case, that line is quite blurred, and there's probably more fiction than fact in it. But in a way, the fiction in it elucidates fact. So the truth comes out through this sort of fictional technique. And the way that the novel's structured is the protagonist, whose name is Kathryn, because it's autofictional, has just left her marriage, just as I also had recently left a marriage around the time that I was writing this book. And she goes to her parents' house to pursue a story about a stillbirth that her mother had before she was born. And her mother is rightfully and fairly not all that willing to participate in this project of Kathryn's, and so she kind of stonewalls her at every opportunity. And one of the ways in which she stonewalls her is by giving her another story about an ancestor whose name is Russell Boyd. And I'm going to read, I think that's enough to kind of set up the reading at least. And we'll talk. I think, Tanis, you're going to ask me questions about autofiction, right? To some extent, so we can get a bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested in the auto fiction of it all, and have a number of questions. So
Okay.
yes,
Well, one of the
get into it
ways,
more.
just to show, like, one of the ways that I played with autofiction is that I incorporated into the text imagery. So this chapter that I'm going to read from, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but it has a photograph of the protagonist of my mother. It actually is a photograph of my mom when she was in her early 20s. And so the photographs I was hoping would kind of work as this enticement into having the reader sort of drop their incredulity, their disbelief, and fall sway to the tricks, the little tricks that are being played out in the novel. So I'm only going to read a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to read from the end of that chapter that photograph's in, when the mother hands this information, this data to Kathryn. Toward the end of the week at breakfast, Mum ceremoniously hands me a manila envelope. "It's for your memoir," she says. "Some correspondence mailed to your great-grandfather. You might as well have it. It's about his father, Russell Boyd, who would have been your great-great-grandfather, though there was little great about him by all accounts. I was thinking this will help you with the Civil War bits of your book. He fought, you know. They say he was cuckoo, even before the war." "First of all, Mum," I say, "we don't say cuckoo anymore. And second of all, you're kidding, right?" "Nothing is really known about him," she says, like she hasn't heard me. "Well, a little is known." "I'm not writing a family history," I say. "I'm writing an extended fictional essay about my dead brother." She purses her lips in that dangerous way she has. I have crossed a line. She says, "You never know, you might need it," and starts to walk away. I look down at the envelope in my hands. I pull the letter out. It's on blue airmail paper. There's another envelope inside the first. The gist of the note on the blue paper is that the enclosed, much older envelope was found in an archive of dead letters at a post office being dismantled in Richmond, Virginia in 1969. The archivist is certain we are the proper recipients of this letter. "Wait," I say, "was I there the day this came in the mail?" "Oh, no," she says, "you'd have been at school." Private Russell Boyd is the name on the front of the envelope, and he is in fact my great-great-grandfather. He was more or less disowned by the family, Mum says. Insane. He was institutionalized after the war. I gently pull the older letter from its envelope. It's foxed and yellowed, brittle, a scrawl of dainty gray quill pen cursive. "Dear Private Boyd, I do not know why you did what you did, and I suppose you must have reasons of your own. For my part, I wish I never was tangled in your business, and you never got tangled in mine. And yet, if you send me back my rightful property, I think I can carry on some. Otherwise, wee Charles requires new breeches and a decent flaxen shirt. Please do send money and news when you can. Sincerely, Christiana Malden." My God, I say, have you read this? Who was she? I think she was a mistress. I hand the letter to Mum. I'm really not planning to write anything particularly historical, I say. I do not want this. This is the last thing I want. She pushes my arm away. Throw it out if you don't want it. Bait. I am stupid. I bring the letter up to my room, sit on the bed and read it over. It smells of some kind of perfume, rose maybe, and dust, and a hint of barnyard, which might be its years of sitting in the pig shed. I know Mum gave me the letter to distract me from my fixation on Wolf, but I won't be waylaid. I tell myself this, but who am I kidding? The thing has its hooks in me already. They say that everything you write self. They say you can't write a character who is not, in some true way, an aspect of yourself. If this is true, then all fiction is autobiography, all writing is self. Maybe I can find my way to Wolf this way. Maybe it's the only way to him. I set the letter on my dresser and sit down to write. I try to become Russell Boyd, my mentally ill ancestor. Thank you.
Right. That's such a great section to read because it does, like, it gives us both those strands already, and there's just already so much in it. Um, and like the autofiction, I have to say, like, the idea that I find quite terrifying. And I'd actually like that last bit that you had read, I jotted down in my notes that quotation of, they say everything you write, just like everything you dream, is a replica of you, of your unconscious self, that every character is you. But now, like, I have all my questions, but I just kind of want to go from what you read and sort of where you started, because that letter is such bait for Kathryn, the character, the narrator. Um, and because you've written this as autofiction, but as you say, it's almost a hoax of autofiction. Was there a letter that, like, because, like, I think, like, as a writer, like, if somebody handed me that letter, it's just begging you to, like, get into it.
Yeah, you want to pursue it. And I think, I mean, that's how, to me, that's how creativity, that is the main operation of creativity, is that there's a disruption. There's a kind of disruption in the thin veneer of what reality looks like. And people who are prone to the imagination, they fall into it. You fall into the gap and you want to fill it. You want to, like, solve the puzzle of the problem that's set out for you by this, like, disruption in the strand, or this thin thing that we call, it's basically words. Like, we create a reality out of words, and then something pushes through that, and you're, like, set on edge by it, or something disorganized in your body, right? And then you want to do something with it. And for me, actually, the truth of the matter, like the autobiographical truth of the matter, is that disruption is the stillborn baby. So that part is true. My mother had a stillbirth before I was born, long before I was born. In the context of the book, I'm the second born after Wolf, this child that doesn't live. But in fact, I'm the fourth after my brother, whose name was Timothy, didn't survive birth. And so that's this sort of disruption for me. And the letter is made up. It's
Right.
fabricated. It's not a real thing.
Right.
Although I love it that people want it to be. I mean, and I think that's part of the game too, is that it's so enticing and so beguiling that the readers want that to be true. They want that thing to be true because it's better than reality almost, that this would exist, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well,
Yeah.
and what I find so interesting about the autofiction, because it's, as you say, like, it is like this kind of this setup that invites the reader to, like, read into the novel and look for biographical clues or autobiographical clues. I've been listening a lot to the new Taylor Swift, and I feel like she is, like, doing that constantly, right? Like, playing with that idea. Is there some, it strikes me though that there must be some protection in it as well as a novelist, like, because you can like, if you were truly writing autobiography or memoir even, then it feels like you need to stick to the facts more. But if you're playing at this autofiction, is there a release even in calling the character by your name, giving her some of the traits that you perhaps possess, that is even more freeing than if you'd called her, I don't know, Sarah or something? Is there?
It was, I have to say that writing the more autobiographical aspects of this novel, it was way harder for me than writing the Civil War aspect. So I mean, I don't think I made this clear in the beginning, but essentially Kathryn starts writing this story of her ancestor who fought in the American Civil War, and who was very mentally unstable, and questionable in his ethics as well. So very complicated, arguably unlikable character. And she gets,
But an enjoyable character. I loved being with him. I loved,
I'm glad. That's
I
great.
loved reading along with him. Yeah, no, he makes some bad choices, but I liked being there next to him.
Yeah, and maybe he's like we all would be in in the instance of a war. Like, I think there aren't that many heroes, right? In fact, so he's really not a hero. He's pretty much the opposite of a hero. He keeps walking away. And in some ways, the relief for me was less the autobiographical aspects, even though I wanted it. I wanted to dare that. Like, that was a risk for me, having only written fiction forever, even though a lot of my fiction does deal with like, at least thematically, with autobiography.
We're losing you a little bit, Kathryn.
Inside another character in a scenario that is a lot more true.
Oh, okay. Kathryn's in the county and her internet's a little bit dodgy. So I'll give her a minute.
Say that again.
Sorry, you're cutting in and out a little bit. So hopefully we can get a little bit of a reset on you. You've frozen on us. Oh, I think you're back.
Yeah. Yeah. So I missed your question. I'm afraid. I'm sorry, Tanis.
Oh no, we lost a little bit of what you were saying just about that, like, tension, but that's fine. We'll just continue on. The bit that you did read where you're like that you can't write a character who is not you. That if that is true, then all writing is in some sense is autofiction, and there's something appealing to me about that idea, but I'm not sure that. I guess I hope it's not true, but like, as a writer, you, Kathryn, do you feel that when you're writing, that like characters are different aspects of you, or that like they're revealing something about you? And if so, like, how do you move through that?
Oh, I lean into it. I mean, I'm interested. I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in the way that my writing elucidates my pathologies, and like, whatever therapy I need, I get it cheaply from like opening my computer and just like pouring forth, but I look for it. I think it's really interesting in writing, and I see it in my students as well. This sort of thing that happens when you're writing, especially when you're writing quickly, like, it's a like talk therapy, stuff kind of burbles out. And in that flow, and in that flow state, it's inevitable that the shit rises, and so, well, what do you do with it when you see it, when you notice it, and it's horrifying to you? You either lean into it because it's juicy. I mean, if it's horrifying to me, it's going to be juicy for a reader. That's what I think, anyway. Yeah. And then I manipulate it. I manipulate it so that it's not me anymore. It's like larger than me, or it's a distortion of that thing. So it's not like, it doesn't give me pain anymore. I've actually like worked with the material in some way to shift its meaning, or to shift its the way in which it might cause me pain, do something with it, or give it to a character that I wouldn't normally have associated with myself. And that can be really interesting, and also, I think, really potent. Like, that seems to me often the most potent writing is when it's a bit personally risky, psychologically risky. And I also think, like, it's inevitable that it happens. Like, I think you can write a fantasy novel. I have students who write fantasy novels and sci-fi short stories and that sort of thing all the time. And yet still that stuff comes up. I'm like, so why is your protagonist so antagonistic to his father in every scene? And they're like, oh, I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm like, no, that's the interesting stuff. Yeah, keep that, hold on to that, do more with that.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I remember one of my first ever writing teachers sort of saying, like, you should always be a little bit uncomfortable. If you're telling the truth, the big capital T truth, you should be a little bit uncomfortable when you're writing, and yeah, moving through that. And you've spoken in other interviews about that this came out of some of that, like, personal writing that you were doing, and that the Civil War kept coming up. And that was something that you kind of leaned into around, like, to get going on this book, and just like why this thing was of interest to you. where you were in your life. Have you resolved it? Is the Civil War still an ongoing process, or?
No, I left my marriage. I mean, maybe this book caused me to leave my marriage. I'm not sure, like that, which you could say is not a good outcome, but also a really good outcome depending on how you look at it.
Sure.
But like I was writing this material, and so the seed of the story, the reason that the Civil War material started coming is that I had read a book about it wasn't about the Civil War, but it had a substitute soldier in it, and I'd never heard of substitution before. And I went back to do a PhD later in life, so I was in my early 50s when I was, doing master's and PhD courses at U of T. And I took a course in early American realism, and there was just this one novel that had a substitute soldier in it, and substitution, and also I was studying psychoanalysis. So the word subsidy happened in the Civil War is that men could, when the first conscription happened, because men who were of age were seeing for the first time in photographs, because photography was fairly early new form, they were seeing in newspapers the carnage that was happening in the Civil War. And obviously they were starting to rethink just how very patriotic they thought themselves to be, or they felt themselves to be. And so less and less people were signing up. And so they created this first conscription in the US. And there was a loophole, and the loophole was that if you could afford it, you could pay for somebody else to fight for you. And so if you were my neighbor and I was a man of age and I was a wealthy industrialist, I could hire you basically to be me. So it felt like an avatar. Like one of the earlier iterations of this novel, that there were gamers in the frame story. And because I was thinking about this idea of an avatar. And so, but anyway, substitution became this like really loud kind of image in my mind. And I started to explore it through these writing sessions that were purely about the Civil War. And I got more and more into it. And I had no idea why, and I do think that like our obsessions tell us something about ourselves, the things that we're interested in tell us something about ourselves. So I was just sort of querying why am I interested in this? How can I make this novel work? Because I was quite convinced that I didn't want to write an historical novel, just as Kathryn in the novel does not want to write a historical novel. I did not want to either. And so I was left with the problem of like, well, what is this book then? Right. And then the analogy, kind of this insight came to me that I was, sort of living in a civil war because my marriage was in tatters sort of towards the end of its life. And I was thinking about how marriage and civil war, like obviously they're not the same thing, but they're like microcosmically kind of similar. Because, well, a family unit is a kind of nation, right? Tiny little nation. So yeah.
So you start with the Civil War stuff, and you don't want to write historical fiction, but
yeah,
but you have certainly part of it is, and I also love that like they both feel very different. They both like have very different tones. And in some ways, I found the historical sections much more sort of visceral and grounded in a way versus the sort of mythicness of what's happening in the present day with the flooding and the dampness and everything creeping up the walls, and the myths that Kathryn, the narrator, is invoking about her past and even in her present. And so how did you then like lean into it as a historical fiction writer? Like what was your like research process, or did you just like throw it at the wall and see what happened? Oh no.
Always, even when I'm writing something that isn't historical, I'm also using the archive as a prompt, like as a kind of like a bin of information that I could get inspired by and come back and write. And so I was doing quite a lot of that. And actually a lot of the Civil War parts of the book were written at Seattle, which is a writing colony in the US and in New York, in Virginia. And so I was in Virginia, really close to where a lot of the battles were fought. So I went and walked around there a bit,
Right.
and also just like dug into digital archives, looking at photographs and just trying to get all the weird. It's a very weird. It's like almost like another planet. If you go back in time, the way that their ethics worked even is quite different.
Yeah. Yeah, the evocation of like a particular historical thing can do so much, right?
You know, if you were, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like, or just like walking around those spaces. I remember listening to an interview with Hilary Mantel years ago when she was first like working on Wolf Hall and talking about how like being in those spaces where those characters had walked, and like, you know, you can read the words or you can look at papers or but like if you can be in the space, it does something to you physically to like know that your character was like walking on those grounds and that kind of thing. And it's I don't tend to believe a lot in like the magicalness of it, but there is something about sitting in those spaces that I find really allows you to tap into that creativity or that kind of extra space. So how did you start to braid these two stories together? So you have the historical component, you have the autobiographical component of the stillborn brother, and like when did they start to marry together? Did that happen fairly naturally, or did you have to like cram them together and then shape this thing? Oh, I'll give Kathryn a second. Oh, there, you're back.
Yeah, it's funny for me, you go away.
Oh, okay. So did you
And
get
I'm
that?
not sure.
Okay, well, let me just give you, I'll recap it a little more briefly though. So you've got these two different sections. You've got the historical stuff that had come up in your, just like in your writing sessions, and you're doing the research and the work on that. And you've got this idea of the autobiographical fiction sections with the stillborn brother. And did they fit together easily, or was it a thing that you really had to like kind of start like cramming them together and then find a way to shape them? Like how did you approach starting to put them together?
Well, I had written quite a lot of sort of memory pieces as I was trying to figure out what that frame was going to be. And at some point I realized that I wanted it to be auto-fictional, but I still didn't quite know why and how. That took a while, but I had a whole bunch, like pages and pages and pages of memories, childhood memories. And I had interviewed my mom actually a number of times about Timothy Wolf in the novel. And you know, kind of knew more about her situation at the time, and we'd looked through photographs together. And so I mean, she was really very generous, actually, Mom was, to do that with me, because I'm sure it can't have been easy for her. And I was just writing as I remembered things. I walked on my childhood property, and that kind of evoked some memories, and I would just write them down and work with photographs from my childhood. And I had all this material, but it wasn't really what it needed to be. And then I think when I figured out that I couldn't make it work, or it didn't want to work as a purely autobiographical frame, then I discarded it, and I started from scratch, thinking through that it was going to be this marriage disillusion, and that it was going to be this kind of journey about both writing and self-psychoanalysis, between what was going on in the Civil War part and what was going on in the real story. And I think over time, the mythos of the frame story, because there's also sort of fairy tale elements in it,
Yeah.
they started to converge, and I was still like trying to puzzle it together. Like there was no point. I kind of like don't work like that. Like I'm not this writer who's like, oh, here's the story and I'm just now going to write it. Yeah, it's more like I have an idea and I have imagery and I'm working towards something, and gradually over a long period of time, it makes sense. And then I can go back and edit toward that thing. But that was a long process, and it's, it's 10 years since all the broken things came out. Of course, I did other things in that 10 years, but it still was a longer process than it would have been if it was a more simple story. Yeah. Um, it wasn't a matter of cramming them together, though. It was more like coming in, standing back, I feel like almost like a visual artist does, like put a daub of paint on the canvas, walk back, look at it, see if it makes sense, see what has to go next to it, and then shifting things around. At some point, I remember the novel was almost like a deck of cards that I was like trying to get in, collate into kind of like a good order. And even towards the end of the edit, I was still doing a bit of that.
And when you were editing, or I guess even in the
So yeah,
sorry, even in the earlier sections of writing, would you work one side of the novel and then the other side, or would you jump back and forth and just like, oh, I'm writing this and now I know I need to do a historical section, now I know I need to do day 20 or whatever, or did like the braiding come later on? Or
it couldn't, because it couldn't really work that way, because the braiding was always dependent on the Civil War part. So I was always having to go kind of straight through, maybe not the whole novel, but sort of sections, and then overlay it and go back again. And it became pretty meticulous, because I wanted the frame story I wanted information from the Civil War story to be seeping back into the frame story, and then the other way around. So you had this sort of like a discourse between the two sections that because the Civil War part is mostly a figment of Kathryn's imagination, and Kathryn's imagination is her psychoanalytic self, it's her unconscious, kind of coming up in these weird ways, in like in a weird setting, in a weird situation. It was necessary that the two work together, because otherwise, they wouldn't speak to each other. They wouldn't speak to each other, and that was super necessary. So
and they do
in a
so
way,
they do so effortlessly, which like to the reader anyway, because like it's only kind of
I was just gonna say, am I froze?
Yeah, no, please go ahead. Oh, that they do speak to each other's.
Thank you. I think you complimented me.
Yes.
I can't remember what I was going to say, except that in some ways there's more autobiography in the undercurrent of the Civil War part than there is in the actual frame story, which purports to be autobiographical, because her rage and her misguidedness and her own mistaking the situation, her own misreading of the situation, is a lot like how Boyd, fumbles through his own life.
Yeah, I did find it, like, because it does, like, it unfolds in this very effortless way to the reader, and but then you step back and you can see like how much work it must take, and you can see that it's a book very much about writing, and this particular process, and how the writer is speaking to her novel, and vice versa. And it was just like, it has those moments of magic that happens in really great books, where you're like, wow, like I want to be able to do that, make these different things speak to each other in that way. I think that's what what the hope is most of the time. So there's so much twinning within the book on both sides. Everybody echoes each other. Everybody is like, there are literal twins, there are the substitution twins, which is so fascinating. I'd never heard of the substitution in the Civil War either. And how did that come? Was that early on, or did the twins kind of, like, you talked a little bit about avatars and the substitution. So obviously, like, from the Civil War part, that was sitting there, but then there's just like this layering upon layering of twins. And then also thinking about Kathryn, the narrator, speaking about how all characters are aspects of the writer. How did that kind of come about? Like, and how do you do that to such an extent without, and like manage to not make it feel like gimmicky or like obvious? Like, you know, like we're still having twins revealed quite close to the end. And I feel like in the hands of a lesser writer, you'd be like, oh my God, well, here we are with an, you know, another set of twins.
Right.
So how did you do it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to answer that question. I just did it. And and also like, I don't know when I figured out that even, like, I feel like I was saying to you that, you know, for me, writing is a process, like figuring out what my book is about is a process that I'm busy with while I'm actually doing the writing. And it can take a long time to figure that out. And I think over the course of the writing, twins, the twinningness of it, or the doubling, all of the doubling that happens, started to be really clear to me. And because it was in the text already, it wasn't like I was like, oh, and I'm going to do this twinning thing. I saw it in my own process, and then I was like, oh, I'm going to leverage this, but I have to be really careful with it because I don't want to reveal anything, or I don't want it to be heavy-handed. I just want it to be yeah, I remember a friend of mine when I first started writing, he was like, you have to be subtle because you want to leave nuggets for future grad students, which is like such an arrogant and like a narcissistic way of thinking about writing. But like, obviously every writer has this dream that their work will live on. And so if there's a puzzle to be solved and the puzzle's around twinning, I would be happy for a master's student to like delve into that and figure that out.
I mean, I think there's lots here for somebody's thesis in the future, several pieces, because like, yes, there's all the twinning. There's also so much about mothering in so many ways as well, in terms of like, obviously the relationship between Kathryn and her mother, Russell and his mother, the Christiana, but then also with the dolls, and like there's all of these, and Kathryn as a mother, the mythology of the Selkie as a mother, and did you like? Yeah, I guess what was the draw around that? I mean, obviously, again, going through you know, a relationship dissolving and thinking about your family, I'm sure must have been a spark of that. But it did seem like there was a lot of mothering and motherhood going on in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not sure. It's such a funny question because I should know the answer to that. It should be like at the you know, at the tip of my fingers. But I feel like some of that was just like purely unconscious, you know, like those connections. But it's true, like as you know, the protagonist, I go back, Kathryn goes back to her mom to like, she wants to solve a problem of like a sibling problem, like a problem, like a loss. She wants to solve a loss that feels really personal to her about somebody that never lived. And it's super potent for her. And I think that, I mean, obviously mothers, they're the concept of mother is this sort of potent, fecund, birthing, creative force, right? And so maybe that just came about because I was writing to some extent, writing about writing. I don't think explicitly in a weird way thinking about, I wasn't really thinking about motherhood, but it's true, it's in there. So you've given me something to now like think about, ponder.
Yeah. Well, and also just so much with the dolls as well, like just like
yeah,
there's these baby dolls around that also really struck me in sort of around the idea of motherhood. I was just lost the next thought that I had, but oh, okay, speaking about mothers, so you said that your mother was very supportive and like talked with you a lot about this. How about like other family? Like, how do you feel about the obligation or do you feel an obligation to family because it's auto fiction? Like, how did you explain it? What obligation did you feel to your family members or to your historical past or fictional past?
I had to get permissions for the photographs because there are
Mhm.
photographs of my sisters. And I don't know, my mom had helped me, but then I changed the story so much that it was no longer her, for one thing. My mother's not nearly as irascible as the mother in the story. She's really actually quite lovely. And so I had to say to her, like at some point, Mom, like you were so generous, you gave me all this information and I've completely corrupted it. And I'm like, like presenting you to the world as this crotchety old lady, which, she is getting older, but she's not crotchety and she's actually really sharp. So I was a bit worried about it. And then even though I had told her and she was like, it's fine, don't worry about it. I went to Ottawa. I gave a reading in Ottawa, and my family all live around there. And my mom came with my aunt, and I was really worried about it because I was just like, it felt shameful. I was going to be reading this part about my mom, and it's not my mom, it's the mom of the character. And my mom was in the audience, and she was loving it. She was like basking in the attention that she was getting. So I think that it all worked out okay. I didn't really talk to my sons about it because they don't really read my work, for one thing, and also they're hardly in it, and also they're not them, like I really did protect them. And yeah, so it was really just my mom and dad, and they were fine with it. I mean, they're used to it by now, that there might be a mom and a dad, and it might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but they're kind of over it. Yeah,
Right.
they support the larger project. Let's put it that way.
Right. So we've got a little more than 15 minutes left. So if you have any questions, anyone in the audience, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll pull them up and try and answer them. We've got one up right now. So first from Stasia Van Linden. First, thank you for your book. I absolutely loved it. I found that both Voight and Kathryn were pushing against the norms of their times, the societal expectations. In response to the book itself, have you found that more people have pushed back against Kathryn, or you personally as a female leaving her marriage, battling her own civil war, marriage, family secrets, versus how readers may have viewed Voight, mentally unstable, bad choices, even a murderer, but somehow not seen as bad as perhaps Kathryn has been? What are your thoughts about this? And thank you for the fascinating juxtaposition in your book.
Thanks, Stasia. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm not really sure what the answer is because I feel like no one has really pushed back on either of those things. I mean, people have been interested in the connection between them, but I haven't had anybody being, sort of repulsed by either, which I'm happy about because in fact, I was a bit worried about how violent the Civil War parts of the novel are at times. And really no one has been upset about that, and nobody seems to be all that upset about me leaving my marriage. I don't know, like I feel like in some ways it is radical still to do that, but not as radical as it might have been 30 years ago or something like that.
Yeah. I guess Kathryn in the book as well, though, like she's so adamant, right? Like her parents do keep trying to be like, you gotta go back, you gotta go back. And she's just like having none of it, right? And has drawn this line. And I can see how some readers might be like, just and like but yeah, it's I loved the violence of the Civil War stuff. And you comment on that even in the book about women writing violence versus men writing violence. And I thought like I loved the battle scenes. I mean, writing an action scene is always fun, but I
Super
mean
fun.
they were brutal though, but that I mean all wars were, but that one is particularly. So Janet has asked, is there a difference between auto fiction and a fictionalized memoir?
I feel like those, it's hard to answer that question too, because I feel like it's like a continuum, right? I mean, I know like I've taught creative nonfiction, and creative nonfiction is essentially journalism, but it's journalism using fictional craft, you know, the craft of fiction. So, you know, dialogue using, but I think that most journalism does that nowadays. So we don't really, we almost don't even think about it as a category, yet it is a category. Fictionalized memoir, I don't know. I'm not sure I know what that is. I sort of feel like all memoir is fictionalized to some extent, though, because of course people are not telling their entire life story, because we would be bored out of our gourds reading it. They're telling this story that has the arc that they can kind of find in their own, you know, life trajectory. At least good memoir does that. But that doesn't make it fiction exactly. It just means that the author has like chosen the nuggets that they're going to tell about themselves, and they've done it in such a way that they give the impression that their life had a kind of particular meaning, whereas in fact our lives don't. Like, not to say we don't have meaning at all, but like our lives don't take the form of meaning. That's why we make stories up, right? In order to do that, because we want to give meaning to our lives. And so we choose sections of our lives, or we choose sections of a fabricated life to sort of get a point across. And autofiction, I think, is really similar. Like if I think about it, the idea of a fictionalized memoir, I feel like autofiction is pretty similar. Like I'm kind of thinking of a writer like Knausgaard, the Norwegian writer. And his work is considered autofiction. And it's kind of seamless in the sense of like you wouldn't know, because it's hard, it's very like sensually realistic. Like there's no fantasy, lofty fantasy kind of like gestures in it. And so it always feels tonally like it could have happened. And I wouldn't know, for instance, the whole first his autofictional project comprises many volumes, and the first volume is about his dad who was an alcoholic and who died, and him kind of cleaning up the house. And I don't know if it's true, but it certainly reads as if it's true. You know, like I was completely convinced that this was the truth. Yeah, so I'm not sure, Janet. I don't know the answer to that. And I think that the blurring of the categories is really interesting, because on the one hand, the categories get blurred and then we don't know what the truth is. So that's kind of a risk, right? Like we're in a kind of an era of journalism in which the truth is very you know, sort of pin downable. We don't really always know what the truth is. And the truth can be really different in one cultural silo to another cultural silo. And both of those groups of people are quite sure that the truth is the truth that they're believing in. And at the same time, I mean, that's awful, but it's also maybe the mess that we need to get through to get to the next, like, to progress as a society, is kind of muddy up what truth is, and then we can figure it out again. Because right now things are pretty messy.
Yeah, it does feel like we're in a moment where people are very desperate to know what is true, right? And we're seeing a lot of like, yeah, sort of nonfiction stories told as fiction and vice versa. And I think people get a little bit anxious about that, and for good reason these days, right? As you say, like even in journalism, like certainly I'm in the States, and you know, there's very different news channels, right? So, but it was also thing that makes me think about, you were talking about like, yeah, we don't live in character arcs, right? We don't have this like neat arc that's going to reveal itself at the end of our lives, or the end of the episode, or what have you. And was thinking about there was a quote that you gave talking about sort of the idea of narrating the world that I'm going to read back to you briefly. I hope readers come to understand the way in which the human world is narrated, at least to some extent, and that the narration is subject to our adherence to it. In other words, we can change it. Even if that change is incremental, storytelling is important, crucial even, because it reminds us that it's all just a story subject to editorial. What story can we tell that is healthy for the planet and for ourselves? And it's in the book, again, in the book it says, is not all writing sacred? If we found a different, better text to believe in way back then, might things have turned out differently? And I love that idea. I worked for a long time with teenage girls in Toronto, working around a kind of idea of like narrative therapy and reading therapy, of just this idea of like, we have stories we tell of our lives, but if you reposition them a little bit, maybe your story can be a little bit different. I just wonder if you want to like expand on that at all. I just like, it's such a hopeful idea, and I think we're short on hope these days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of the project. And it's not just a project inside the book, it's a lifelong project for me of kind of scrutinizing, or not kind of, deeply scrutinizing my own interests, you know, my own obsessions, my own writing as I'm writing it. And if I do that and I do it in an honest way, if I'm truthful to myself about it, then I see myself like reflected back, right? And that reflection can allow me, if I'm brave, to put a wedge in the repetition or the trauma that I may have incurred in my lifetime. And by doing that, it seems to me that I heal a little bit. And also, if I heal a little bit, then everybody heals a little bit around me, because I'm doing some work that then makes me wiser, or makes me kinder, or more compassionate, and just a better person generally, because I'm not all befuddled by, you know, my trigger points or whatever. I'm just like able to stand up and be confident and be present in a better way. So like that, like it's small, it's really small, but maybe that's the only way to do it. And I'm just looking at one of these other questions somebody's asking, but this is a work of fiction. Why do we have to know if something is true? And I think that's a really good question. And I think it's a question that's always been kind of asked. It's always been asked from the very beginning of the novel. So the novel, the English novel, kind of begins to form as a genre in the 18th century, which is my area of study in university. So I can pretend I'm an expert on it. And one of the first novels, maybe even purportedly the first novel, is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And when that book came out, people believed that it was, well, he presented it as if Robinson Crusoe had written it. Instead of it saying by Daniel Defoe, it said by himself. So it was as if Robinson Crusoe had written it, and as if this whole saga was true, even though it's like completely impossible. And then when people discovered that it wasn't true, they were furious, like really furious. And that happened a lot in the 18th century, because people didn't know how to read for fiction, because there was no category. And so it was in development. And so the novel form, as it's developing, is also a pedagogical. Inside of the novel, there's a kind of pedagogy of how to read the novel, so that readers will begin to understand what is fiction and what is autobiography, I guess, or true. But the thing is that I think that the anonymous attendee who posted that question asked a great question, because truth is not so much whether the thing itself happened, it's what comes out of the like energetic discourse between the text and the reader. That's way more important to me anyway. So the truth of the book is going to be different depending on who's reading it, to some extent, because you know, you picked up those particular moments, Tanis, but somebody else might have picked up other moments and responded to other moments. And so truth is something about, for me anyway, when I'm writing a novel, truth is not so much whether I'm accurate, it's whether I elicit a response, and also whether the thematics of the book kind of blossom. That's important to me too. So I think it mostly has, like, from the response that I've got, but that's what I always want. Like, did my meaning making come across? And however I have to get at it, whether I'm telling the truth or whether I'm writing about Selkies and a Civil War ancestor that never existed, then that I don't care. Like, you know, like, as long as I get what I need out of it.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Actually, in this next question from Michelle Viscount, is something that I was curious about, particularly interested in the autofiction aspect. I'm curious as to whether you'll use this method in your future work once you have the realization that all fiction contains aspects of ourselves. Can you ever not have that realization? Will you use this technique again, do you think?
I mean, I won't explicitly do it. The novel that I'm working on right now is a kind of reimagining of a childhood that I would have had if I grew up in a better era. So I'm not going to say more about it, but it's kind of like I'm sort of imagining back in history the childhood that I had. Not that I had a bad childhood, I didn't have a bad childhood, but like this sort of, I sort of feel like it's taken me almost 60 years to figure out who I am and to feel comfortable in my skin. And I just wonder if my childhood had been different, if the era I had grown up in had been more progressive, if that I could have figured that out sooner, and that then I might have had a less neurotic life.
Interesting. Yes, and our anonymous attendee has commented that Sadie Smith's The Fraud is kind of the same, playing with a lot of the same ideas. They say with humor. I think there's some funny bits in your book too.
Oh, thanks.
But yeah, it's interesting. Like I think a lot about like the truth and fiction thing, and I've often played with like something that's been inspired by an actual event, or like I have like worked on historical fiction, and people are always worried about that. And I as we were sort of talking about, it doesn't seem like an unfair worry, especially these days of like what's true, but I think truth has always been messier. And like, yeah, like the idea of like literary hoaxes and I mean, yeah, people have been writing under false names and like framing stories for forever. But and I think there's something wonderful about that discomfort of like, is this true? Is this not true? Like
there was a woman in the 18th century who hoaxed London for a really long time into believing that she had given birth to 17 rabbits. So, I mean, the truth usually is something that we discover in hindsight. You know, the whole of it, it's not visible to us until later. And then we see the whole, more and more the whole picture, because you can't see the whole picture until you have a kind of panorama, a perspective, which of course is what fiction can provide, right? No other form can really provide this, but fiction can. And fiction can also do this wonderful thing of providing us with the interiority of more than one character. And that's a huge privilege to, in my opinion, as a reader, that's a huge privilege to the reader, because we don't ever get that. That's like something that we are barred from in our day-to-day lives. And so there's a kind of relief to a novel in which you are privileged into the interiority of more than one character.
were there any books in particular that, or works, movies, what have you, that inspired or that you like went back to, or the things that you kind of returned to while you were working on this?
I don't read a lot of fiction when I'm writing, but towards the end of the sort of last passes, when I was really trying to figure out the frame story, which was harder for me, as I mentioned, I read everything that Sigrid Nunes has written, and because I found some solace and maybe even inspiration in her tonality, like the sonic quality of the narration. There was something there for me, and I don't think I come close to replicating it. I mean, we're not the same person, and I didn't want her imprimatur in the sonic quality of my book anyway. But there was something there that helped me to manage those aspects of the book.
It's interesting. So you tend to stay away from other fiction while you're in it, while you're
Yeah, and also like there's only so many hours in the day, and if I'm writing, I just don't have as much time to indulge in other people. I obviously read my peers when they publish, but I don't yeah, I'm not wantonly reading novels while I'm writing a novel. I'm reading a lot of nonfiction often.
Right. What are you reading right now before I let Daphne back in?
Oh, I'm reading this sort of like 1980s queer pornography right now.
Oh,
It's called
excellent.
86 or something like that. And I'm about to read Heidi Reimer's new book, The Mother Act, which she's a friend of mine, and she just published this
Great.
beautiful novel that's getting all this attention. Yeah,
great.
beautiful review in the New York Times, and yeah, super exciting.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
And thank
Tanis.
both of you. Oh my gosh, that was just riveting. And I can't thank you enough. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed hearing from both of our authors as much as I did. This interview will be available on our YouTube channel should you know somebody who missed it and wants to see it. And please don't forget to join us next Wednesday on May 22nd, not the 28th, as was originally scheduled, to hear author Andrew Sullivan interview Manaka Raman-Wilms, whose book, The Rooftop Garden, was longlisted last year. If you have subscribed to our book club mailing list, you will be sent a registration notice. If you're not part of that list, please just head over to our website. And thank you again so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye.